This is a guy you get a sense of who is proud, and he's self-indulgent, and he's making really important decisions at a drinking party. It's kind of awful that this is the guy who's in charge of the empire, and nobody can stand up to him. I mean, even the queen can't stand up to him. Okay, now, there were a couple of things last week that were missing. Do you remember what they were? God. So there's no mention of God. Not just in the first chapter of Esther, there's no mention of God in the entire book. So we'll talk more about that as we go through. Anything else that was missing? Do you remember from last week?
God's people.
Yeah, the people of God have not shown up. There's nobody yet who belongs to God, which is very unusual in biblical narrative. The only other book where that happens is Genesis. All of the other books in the Bible, the people of God show up. At least one person who belongs to God shows up in the first chapter. So, where are the people of God, and why have they not shown up yet? Well, they'll show up in chapter 2. Okay, so let's look at chapter 2. We'll read it, and we'll go through the questions.
The thing that was interesting, too, is that once the law was made, that was it. It cannot be changed no matter what.
That's right.
And that's carried over into our own vernacular, hasn't it? According to the needs of the version, we can't change this idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we see, I just said that. No, and I think I heard that expression somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting.
It's a little scary, that kind of power, that you pass that law. You can't repeal it. Yeah. All right, chapter 2. Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive was Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. All right, so how does chapter 2 open? What happens in verses 1 to 4?
He's calmed down.
Yeah, and we know actually from what comes in verse 16 that this is about 6 years later. This is like this is about 6 years into Xerxes' reign. So historically, this would have been after his failed attempt to invade Greece. So he's done his military campaign, been defeated, come back home. Now he's back home, his fury subsided, and then what? Sobers up, yeah, that's true.
Well,
Took a while, yeah.
before this, but you wonder when it says that he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and then what he had decreed against her. You wonder if he might have had some regrets about that.
Only because he wasn't having relations.
I agree. I don't think he forgot her.
Right.
I think he's sitting there regretting his present situation.
Okay.
And I don't know if he regrets that she's gone or not, but certainly his present situation, he doesn't like it. And so here he is, wishing he had a queen, I guess. And so what did they propose?
A search.
A young beautiful virgin.
Okay, it's a little more awful than that. Tell me what they're going to do.
Kind of a roundup.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. They're going to
It's not, they're not placing an ad in the paper and inviting girls to apply.
Mhm.
No, they're rounding up girls possibly against their will.
Yeah, we're not told if they're taken by force or not, but when you know the character of this king and that everybody is at his disposal, I just kind of assume the commissioners are rounding up all the pretty girls that they can find.
Yeah, because they're bringing into the harem.
That's right.
So,
Mhm. Yeah. So they're going to have a search for all these young women, gather them into the citadel at Susa, and then have them placed under the care of the king's eunuch, who's in charge of all these women, and give them beauty treatments, and then they're going to use that like a competition to decide who's going to be the next queen. What they do is they put them through this year of beauty treatments, and then they bring them one by one to spend the night with the king. Now that's going to keep him occupied for a while, and in the end he can choose his queen and add all the rest to his harem. And he thinks that's a great idea. It's kind of like the royal version of The Bachelor, quite frankly, but a lot worse. I mean, at least theirs wasn't televised. but yeah.
It mentioned virgins.
Mhm.
So how old do you think these girls were?
Probably teenagers. I'm guessing probably mid to late teens. Yep.
Yeah, it does say beautiful young
Mhm.
virgin.
Yeah. And typically a girl would have been married before she was 20. So I'm guessing a lot of these are teenage girls.
Like, wasn't it start 12 to 13?
It could, depended. I mean, it started pretty young.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're bringing all of these girls in, and I expect there are some of these girls who probably come from backgrounds where they're like, maybe they feel like they'd hit the lottery, like maybe it'll be me and I'll be the next queen. And there are probably some other girls who don't want to go, and but this is what the king wants, and so it's and he does it empire-wide. We're not talking like the size of Fremont County. I mean, this is empire-wide. There are loads of women who are being gathered in for this. And of course, when the king hears this, he thinks it's a great idea. Okay, now, who enters the story in verse 5?
Mordecai.
Yes, tell me about Mordecai. What does it say about him?
That he was Jewish
Mm-hmm.
and that they were carried away, they were captured
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and taken away. And that he brought up Esther because her parents were dead.
Right. So all of a sudden, the people of God show up in the story. So here's the first mention of God's people. And in Susa, there's this Jew named Mordecai, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which is going to be important. So the author gives us his whole pedigree, including the names of his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and the fact that his family had been carried into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar during the first invasion of Jerusalem. That means that Kish, who's mentioned here, and Daniel were contemporaries. So that first invasion was about 100 years prior to this. So his ancestors were taken captive by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians got conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And so here are the Jews occupied now by the Medes and the Persians. So he has this cousin, the daughter of his uncle, whose name is Hadassah in Hebrew. And Esther, they're not quite sure, but the Persian word for star is Esther, so it might be that this is the name that's given to her by the Gentiles in the empire, that they call her Esther because it's the Persian word for a star. It could also be there's a Babylonian goddess whose name is Ishtar, and maybe this is a version of that, but it's whatever it is, it's the Gentile name that's given to her, and her Jewish name is Hadassah. So she's young, she's beautiful, and because she's an orphan, Mordecai takes her in and raises her as his own daughter. Okay, now, let's just stop for a minute and talk about this. So here are the people of God, they're present, but how important do you think they are in the Persian Empire? I think they are very insignificant. They're a minority people group who are just, I think they're a byword. Nobody really pays attention to them. If anybody's paying attention, there must be some hostility because you notice that Mordecai told Esther to keep her background quiet.
Right.
So, it's not like the Jews are a powerful group in the empire. They're not, which I think is part of the reason they haven't been mentioned until chapter 2. Because the author's giving us this impression that these people, the Jews, are not powerful. They are not significant. They're not the kind of people who could stand up to the king, for sure. They are something of a byword. And that's interesting because the reason why are they in this situation?
Because they were captured, they were taken from where they belonged.
Yes.
They were under the hand of authority of a foreign nation.
And why did they get captured? Bad luck? Sin. Like, for how long?
100
Forever.
100 years, right? You said for 100 years?
They are not under the occupation of the Persian Empire because they made a few mistakes. They were sent into exile because they rebelled against God for centuries. And he had actually told them 500 years before this, when Solomon, not quite, maybe 400 years, when Solomon became the king, and he dedicated the temple. Solomon prayed at the temple that God would bless the temple, the people, the nation, and God answered him, and one of the things God said was, if you rebel against this covenant, if you rebel against the God you say you worship, if you rebel, there will come a point where you will be made a byword. You will lose your temple, you will lose your king, you will lose your nation, and you will become insignificant among the peoples. That's why they're in the situation they're in, is because they rebelled for hundreds of years. And they're in exile because it's the judgment for their own sin. So now they're insignificant, exactly the way that God said they would be. And then we get this bit about Mordecai. That's really interesting that we get so much detail about him. So the mention of his tribe and his father are not so unusual in biblical narrative. But to get the details of, like, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, plus the circumstances of the exile, all included in his introduction, that's very unusual. It's not just unusual in the book of Esther. It's unusual in Old Testament narrative that somebody gets this much detail when they get introduced. So what is it about this introduction of Mordecai that's important? Okay, now, his tribe is important, that he's a Benjamite. And also, it's interesting that the names of his grandfather and his great-grandfather, Shimei and Kish, are the same as the names of a couple of ancient Benjamites who were mentioned way back in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And both of those men are relatives of King Saul. So Kish is the name of King Saul's father. Shimei was one of his cousins or his nephew or something like that. And so it's not unreasonable to think that if these ancestors of Mordecai share the names of those ancient men, that Mordecai himself is descended from the clan of King Saul. Because it's like if you were descended from George Washington, sooner or later someone in your family is going to get the name George, right? And he's got names like that connect him back to the clan of King Saul. Now that's very interesting. Why would it matter that he's a Benjamite who is connected to the clan of King Saul? It's going to matter in chapter 3. So file that away in the, cliffhanger. So it's going to matter when we get to the introduction of Haman. So just file that away in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to it next week, because this background of Mordecai is really important for what happens in the story. So it's significant that he's not just a Jew, but he's a Benjamite who has a connection to King Saul. Okay, now what happens to Esther in verses 8 and 9?
It just tells that he's taking care of his cousin.
Eight and 9.
She was also taken
Yeah.
to the king's palace along with the other virgins.
Yep. She gets rounded up with everyone else. And how does it go for her when
She gets a place of honor.
She like wins over the guy who's in charge. So he singles her out from all the others, and he gives her special treatment. But the author adds right here that Esther doesn't tell anyone that she's a Jew because Mordecai has forbidden her from doing so, which makes me think maybe the Jews are kind of persona non grata around here. But just as a father would do, the author tells us too, Mordecai's making a point of hanging out near the courtyard of the king's harem in order to find out how she is and what's going on. Okay, now, what does it tell us about this whole process that women go through, starting in verse 12?
It's very elaborate.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
crazy, really.
Mm-hmm.
6 months with oil and another 6 months with spices and ointments. So they put them through this rigorous, intense, and long, that's like a year of being bathed in spices and oil.
Yeah. This,
Well, I'm sure he wasn't purified.
no. And this Persian bachelor thing is a long and drawn out process, but
And it seems to me that every maid's turn, he's taking a different woman every night.
That's right.
And she doesn't get come forward until the 10th month.
that's when Esther comes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's
Yeah.
like boggles the mind.
Historically, he's an infamous womanizer, this king. Collects women like postage stamps. And she, so it says a woman could go, she would go through this whole year, then when it was her turn to go to the king, she could take anything she wanted. She'd spend the night with him, then she'd become a concubine of the king, which is basically a second-class wife. And then she would spend the rest of her life in his harem, because she was not allowed to return to her family and her life. If the king rejected her, it didn't matter. She now belonged to him. And so all these women that he collected, and I assume there were hundreds of them, would be now in the harem of the king in luxurious desolation for the rest of their lives. So it's not, there's luxury, but it's not,
There's not freedom.
no.
And there's not a fullness of life.
No,
Like they
there's not.
can't really,
Mm-mm.
they can't live and
Can you imagine all these women living together? You know? And they're young women who don't have a lot of sense and compassion
Like
and,
the generation,
lying.
like that generation, they're missing the life.
Yeah.
Weren't women looked down on at this time? And
Yes.
they may not have had like the love relationships that we experience today. So how does that play in?
Well, again, I think it depends on probably the family background that you come from. For some of these women, it might be actually better, the situation they're going into. But for some of the women, if you have a decent family
You
and
know,
prospects for a decent marriage, it's probably worse to go into. But yeah,
I said that earlier, thinking of the jealousy and competition that might be erupting between them. But then there's also the other side of that coin, is that in this society, families tend to live together generationally. And so a lot of these women maybe are being torn from those mother-daughter relationships women like Ruth who are looking for sisterly companionship, motherly companionship, and advice and relationship. So,
Well, and if this is an empire-wide gathering of these women come from all kinds of
all
backgrounds,
cultures.
all sorts of different pagan religious backgrounds.
And they're
so-
also young. Who's a adult woman that's had, experience to help? Oh, wait, they don't need it, I forgot.
Yeah, and it's the eunuchs who are in charge of this.
Right, but doesn't,
Are the eunuchs men or women?
Men,
Yeah. Emasculated men.
yes. Yeah,
because they couldn't do
Yes.
anything about it, even if they were tempted.
yeah. So you get the sense, I think, that the king uses the women. I mean, it's just the king can do whatever he wants with the women,
Right.
and he does. And nobody can stop him.
Some of those women might be in love with somebody else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Right.
right. That's right. But everyone's just at the king's disposal, and who can stop him? He does what he wants.
Were the women back then in this culture, were they promised to their spouses? Were they promised like
Probably.
I'm sure that marriages were arranged.
Yeah.
already?
At what age, I don't know, but yeah,
But
I'm sure
like
there were
Sally
arranged
said, there are a lot
marriages.
of different cultures that have been conquered by this king. So that's quite a mess.
Yeah, they were considered property of the father of the patriarch to be given away.
There must have been some kind of hierarchy in the harem too, because they were taken back from the king if even like to a second harem in custody of the king's eunuch. So I did that. Kind of.
It's all kind of unpleasant, to put it mildly. Yeah, it's not good.
Would you say she was a woman of faith, that this greatly bothered her? Or did she just willingly
I don't
look to
know.
Mordecai?
I don't have the sense that she volunteered.
Yeah.
And we'll get to
Right.
that in just a minute.
Okay.
But you don't ever, the author just doesn't spend any time on all the moral implications of this situation. You do just think, here's a Jewish woman who's going to end up married to a pagan king. That's bad news.
Right.
And what does she think about all of that? And is she upset or frustrated or, the author just never talks about any of that.
Only that she was obedient.
Yeah,
Mordecai.
yeah. But, yeah,
And the deeper you realize that, the deeper you realize how God has a plan.
yeah, even though it never gets mentioned.
Yes.
We'll come back to that. Hold that thought for just a minute. Yeah. Okay, so when Esther's turn comes, how does it go? This is verse 15.
She didn't ask for anything other than what the guy told her to.
So she doesn't have her hexing mirror when she goes in.
She wanted favor,
Mhm. With who?
the king.
Mhm. Anybody else?
Okay.
The eunuch.
The eunuch. And then everyone in the palace. Did you notice, Esther wins the favor of everybody.
All who saw her.
Everyone likes Esther. Which makes me think maybe it's not just about her looks. There must be something about her character and her personality that makes people, really like her. But everybody likes her. Yeah. Yeah, so she wins the favor of everyone, including the king. He's the most important, and he chooses her to become the queen in place of Vashti. So he puts the crown on her head, and he gives this great banquet in her honor for all the nobles and officials, declares this empire-wide holiday for the occasion. It's so interesting, this one woman being given so much favor by everybody.
And
Okay.
holds a big secret.
Yeah. One of the things, though, that interests me in this whole section is that repeated emphasis on physical attractiveness. There's no doubt that this new queen is intended to be a trophy wife. She's supposed to be
Right.
someone who looks good and doesn't cause trouble. And all the women are essentially just eye candy, and it might be the case, well, we know it's the case, Esther found favor with people because of something besides just how she looked. But the decision, the choice of the new queen is made primarily on the grounds of her physical appearance. Now, why does that matter? Well, Esther's situation is a little sticky, like we said. She's a Jewish woman facing marriage to a a pagan king. But whatever the difficulties of that, the author's not bothered by that. What he does do, though, is he sets up some irony that emphasizes the unexpectedness of what comes later. Esther's chosen for her looks, not her brains. It's her looks that get her in the door. But her appearance is never going to be mentioned again. This is the last time in the book there's any indication about what she looks like. Because it's not going to be very long before it's her courage and her shrewdness that are going to completely take over the story, not how she looks. It's such an interesting thing that Xerxes' choice has nothing to do with how smart she is. And she's going to outsmart him. And he's not going to know it. He's not even going to know what she's doing when she does it. Yeah, so no one in the palace can see what's coming, but the irony is really profound that he's just looking for a woman who won't cause trouble. But he has inadvertently brought into the palace a woman who's perfectly capable of outsmarting him if she's going to.
But before he proven himself to be foolish.
Yes.
So he's foolish anyway, and it kind of comes out even more.
Yeah, yeah. And he's proud and foolish, which means he's manipulatable.
Yeah, because it seems like his advisors are the ones that are coming up with the punishment
Oh, yeah.
and the edicts.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't seem like he's gathering them in and what should I do? I'm really upset about this. It's like, hey, your wife friended you off and you got to do something and let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
So he seems like you said able to be
Yeah,
manipulated.
yeah.
And that's what, the situations, it happens every time that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's not his thought that brings about the change.
Mm-hmm. His pride makes it easy to manipulate him because if his advisors know what to tell him, if they know how to stroke his ego, they can get him to do what they want. I wonder if a woman could do that too. Okay, so Esther is the new Vashti. And this is interesting because when the king makes Esther the queen instead of Vashti, you see him carrying on the usual stuff. So we've got the big banquet again, all the nobles and the officials are present, this empire-wide holiday. Okay, so is it a good thing or a bad thing that Esther's in this position? I mean, on the surface, it almost looks like a kind of pseudo-Cinderella story, where this Jewish orphan is now the queen of Persia. That sounds great, right? Mm-hmm. But when you know what the king expects of his queen, and when you know what happened to Vashti, you can't help but think she had better mind her P's and Q's, or she's out the door. I mean, if she says anything contradictory, or if she speaks her mind, she's in big trouble. And we know that from what already happened in chapter 1. She's not his confidant. She's not his friend. She's not a wife in the sense that we think of her being the wife. She's just his latest acquisition, and when he gets tired of her, she'll be sent off just like all of the others. Yeah. All right, now, speaking of, it's like she's completely under the thumb now of this proud and self-indulgent king. Good times. But speaking of being under the thumb of the king, I wonder if you notice there are a lot of passive verbs in this section. Now what I mean by that is lots of people in this chapter are being acted upon. Did you notice how many times the author mentions people being taken, people being brought, people being placed, people being carried? The people of Israel, the women, and Esther in particular. Why does that matter? Because there's this emphasis on the fact that everyone is at the disposal of the king. And nobody's in control of their own situation. So for Esther too, it's not what she's doing, it's what's being done to her and for her. So it conveys this kind of sense that here's this Jewish woman with no power over her own situation. It seems appropriate because the king has all the power and all the control, and here's a woman who looks like she's being swept along by circumstances that she has no control over. But that theme of who is in control or not is hugely important in this book. It's huge. Who is in control? We'll come back to that too in just a minute. Okay, now let's look at the last section of this chapter. So sometime later, we don't know quite when this is, but there's a second gathering of all the young women. For what reason, the text doesn't really say. Maybe it's after Esther's been named the queen. Maybe it's part of the celebration. But at any rate, what happens with Mordecai in 19 to 23?
Mordecai's position at this point is very interesting because
Mm-hmm.
And that implies that he has some sort of official capacity.
That's right. The first time I read this, I thought, oh, so he's just hanging around at the gate? That's kind of what it sounds like.
Right.
But he's not. This, you're right, sitting at the gate refers to an official position. So the gate to the palace complex had a building where all these legal and commercial transactions took place, and the men who sat at the gate were government officials of some sort. So Mordecai works for the palace, yeah.
Right.
And what happens while he's doing his job? What's that?
He is eavesdropping. He hears a plot.
Yeah.
He overhears a plot
Mm-hmm.
of some disgruntled, two of the king's eunuchs who are disgruntled and plotting to kill the king.
Well, and this is like his officers who guard something. So yeah, they're going to assassinate the king. And I thought when I read that, Mordecai could have just looked the other way.
Right.
I mean, this is just how empires go, and it's not like Xerxes is a real stand-up kind of guy. But he doesn't look the other way. He tells Esther, and she informs the king. And the author repeats right here that Esther's still keeping her background a secret. So the people of the palace, maybe they don't know the connection between Esther and Mordecai. I don't know. But when she tells the king about the conspiracy, she makes sure to give credit to Mordecai as the one who exposed it. So the charges are investigated, they're found to be true, and the two men get executed. And depending on your translation, it might say something like hung on a pole. It's actually, they were impaled on poles. It's pretty brutal. So it's not hanging by a rope, it's being impaled. The Persians were brutal that way. So all this gets recorded in the official annals of the king, what it is that Mordecai did.
Right.
Now that's important because the Persian kings kept these records of whoever was a benefactor to the monarchy, so to speak. So people who did things to help the king or displayed significant loyalty, they kept records of that because the kings were typically really quick to reward people because they wanted to encourage that kind of loyalty in the empire. But as we'll see, Mordecai's good deed for some reason gets recorded but not rewarded. It's going to go overlooked. Yeah.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So, Esther got the news to the king, but it doesn't say she went before the king. Because the women, they're not allowed, no one's allowed before the king unless he
Right.
summons them, right?
Right, but it's possible to request an audience with the king.
Right, so I was just,
Yeah. Yeah. And he can answer or not. But
Right,
you
right.
can ask for an audience with the king, and if he agrees to
yeah,
it, then
that, I
you
was
can
just
go before.
wondering.
Yeah. Okay, now this little bit about Mordecai and the conspiracy, we'll come back to that next week, because that's going to be important too. And, it's just interesting, twice the author says Esther's hiding her background, which isn't hard to understand, because being an ethnic minority presents a challenge, and obviously the Jews are trying to stay under the radar. They're trying not to rock the boat or get anybody's attention. And Mordecai is clearly concerned about Esther being known as a Jew when she's in the palace. So nobody in the palace knows that she's a Jew.
Right.
Nobody does, including the king, which is also going to be important later. So,
And it's obvious he didn't ask, because it's not important to him.
no, it doesn't matter to me. I'm sure he didn't chat about her family or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, the king holds tremendous power, and he uses it to reinforce his own glory with little or no thought to the consequences of anybody else. And Esther and Mordecai are up against serious odds if they're going to try to survive in the Persian palace. But already you see Esther getting all of this favor from people. It almost seems like somebody's on her side. Well, let's talk for a minute about, back to the fact that God doesn't get mentioned. So we talked a bit last week about this fact that he doesn't get mentioned through the whole book. And when he doesn't get mentioned, you start to get this sense, this feeling like he isn't there. Now we know that he is, but you get the feeling that he's not, because who looks like they're in control?
The king.
The king and the Persian officials look to be the ones who are in control, and nobody can do anything about it. And it's interesting too when you know the theological background of the nations in this area. So the nations in the ancient Near East believed about their gods, that their gods controlled a particular region. So the Philistine god controlled the region of the Philistines. The Moabite god had power over the region of the Moabites. And the Hittites and the Assyrians, they had power over this area. If you went to battle against another nation and you defeated them, the implication of that was that your God had defeated their God. Okay, now think about that kind of theology in relation to what's happened to the Jews. So on the surface, they've been conquered by the Babylonians, who've been conquered by the Persians, and they're now living outside of their own land. In the paganism of that time, that would mean their God has been left behind. Who is it who's in charge of them? The Persian god and the Persian king. Because the God of Israel got defeated, didn't he? He's only in control of the area around Israel, and he's been conquered, hasn't he? It's the most normal question in the world for the Jews, who are now in exile under the Persians, to think, where is our God? Is he here, and is he powerful in Persia? Like, is the God of Israel sovereign in Persia? And when he looks to have been conquered by the Babylonians, is he still in control? Is he still there? Is he still powerful? And how do you know? Now, we know from the rest of the Bible that he is sovereign. But when you can't see him doing dramatic things, it's the most normal thing in the world to think, who's really in control? Because I can't see God at work right now. It feels like this person is in control, that king is in control, these officials are in control, and the people of God are just swept up in circumstances they have no control. Is he there? And if he is, how do we know it? And can we trust that he's in control? I think that's the question of the book of Esther, is who is in control? Is he there, and is he really in control? Now, is any of that relevant to us? Mm-hmm. Good. Tell me how.
Well, I think it's really relevant, given recently with the passing of Amy and Marilyn's father and husband, David, in our church family here, and that we see that, we were all just here last week and just going to pray for a little bit of adjustment in his medication, and then we don't know. We have no control, like we're just, praying, and then just we hear that he's life-flighted, and then boom, and it's just, it happens so fast, and it just shows you how little control medications or, that it is all our lives. Our bodies, that's what I'm going for. Our lives, our bodies are not in our control. They're in his hands when he comes to take us away, and when and why, for his will, for his reasons. We don't know why, but he has a reason that we don't know. But we just have to trust that as well, like no matter how hard and bad and hard it seems, that there is a purpose, and there is something that he's showing us always.
If you know what's coming in the story, I'm guessing most of you do. Yesterday at Set Free, I was teaching this. None of the women at Set Free have read the book. They have no idea what's coming. It's great.
They haven't read ahead?
They did. I know. I was like, you didn't read ahead? No, I decided not to. I didn't want to ruin it. I was like, but I'm assuming you all know what's coming in the story. You know that there's a big redemptive reversal right in the middle of this book, and who's in control of that reversal? It's not Esther. It's God who's in charge of that reversal. That's really important, because all of that points to the big redemptive reversal, which is not actually about Esther and the Jews and their circumstances. It's about us and the fact that our God walked out of his own grave. That's the redemptive reversal that matters for us and shows us he's in control of the things that really matter. And that's really important this week when we think about death and it comes suddenly. there's a redemptive reversal in the Bible that gives us hope in the middle of that. Not just individually, but even in the things that we face as a nation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Doesn't it feel like when you look at the news, like we have no control over all the crazy stuff that's going on? There are people making decisions about us and for us where you're like, that's the wrong decision and I can't stop you and now I have to deal with the consequences, and it just feels like somebody else is in control. So is our God in control? Yes, he is. Yes, he is.
What's really wonderful about all of that too, though, when you see his control and you know that he controls your life, the big comforting part of all that is that he has a plan and he also gives us a place. He gives us a place that we know we're going to, which is really comforting to me, because he's not just in control, and he's gonna lead you wherever, and not comfort you and
He's going to walk alongside you.
He's gonna
Right.
walk alongside you the whole time and walk you right through the door of his house. That's what's comforting to me.
Because how long does he stick with you? Until you die?
No,
No.
forever.
He's on the other side of the grave too.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right. He's with us always.
Yeah, that's right.
And I believe that people of faith, the Jews, they're still worshiping, they're still praying. But it doesn't say, they don't do it publicly, they don't build temples, I assume. They don't have idols and things. But the mindset, they still have faith. So, but they don't put it out there because they're the lowest class. And they're trying to protect themselves.
Yeah, and we're going to see them fast later, and I think the implication is they do believe that God is there and they are praying. But isn't it a difficult thing when you're surrounded by a culture that's opposed to your God?
True.
I mean, do we know anything about that?
We're learning.
We are. We don't know it like the believers in China know it, but we're starting to get a taste of, what it's like when we have a culture that's completely opposed to our God. And again, to just look around and think, is he here and how do we know? Because it's not like he's sending a prophet with a, with the megaphone or something. It's not like we're seeing big miracles or he's making the sun go out like he did in Egypt, but is he there and is he in control? The thing is, we're already seeing things, very undramatic things, but things in the background that show he's in control because of all the favor that Esther gets in the palace, because of the fact that Mordecai overhears this assassination plot. And all of this is going to get tied into, in the next chapter, the background of Mordecai and ancient promises that God has made 1,000 years before this, that he still has to bring to fulfillment. And how's he going to do that? It's like he's in mustard seed mode. He's not doing dramatic miracles in front of everybody, but he's orchestrating things under the surface. So to bring about the fulfillment of the things that he wants. And he does it even if nobody notices. He's doing what he'll do because he's faithful to his word. He will do what he's promised.
With all this chaos that's going on and everything, with Russia and with our president and with everything that's going on, it's awesome being a believer, and it's awesome being around believers because there's peace there. Because we just know who God is, and we know the plan that he has for us. So we know that, there's no need to join the chaos.
That's right. He has overcome the world.
He has.
That's right.
It's exactly what you're saying. You think of the woke society and what they're pushing on us, and that men have babies, and it's just so secure, so precious to go to God's word and say, he's got it. Okay, this is crazy. Where's the common sense today? And yet, it's nice to hide in that cleft of his word.
There's stability here. There's
Yes.
peace here. There's a foundation to stand on here. And so many people in our society are missing that.
Yes.
And there's just confusion and fear and chaos outside of something firm to stand on.
And I feel a little bit like, we might be a little bit like Israel in the fact that we've turned our hearts from God, and we do that, we're gonna suffer the consequences.
That's right. Well then, which raises the question, if we're in a situation where we're suffering the consequences of our own sin, is God with us in that too? I mean, isn't it like, I think, well, maybe this is just me, but I think it's the most natural thing in the world when you're on the other side of your own sin to feel like, I can't really ask God to help me, can I? Because I'm getting what I deserve. I knew what I was doing and I did it, and it's really hard to pray when you know, okay, I sinned, and does that mean God's just like, well, hope you learned your lesson, best of luck to you?
No.
We have a God who brings consequences to sin, but he doesn't leave us to walk through those consequences alone. We have a God who actually walks through the consequences of our sin with us. That's hugely important. That here's Israel suffering the consequences of their own sin. God has not abandoned them to those consequences. He's there with them just like he's there with us. And so even if we're getting what we deserve in some sense, we never ultimately get what we deserve because Jesus got what we deserve. But if we're getting consequences from our sin, that doesn't mean we stand back and say, okay, God, I'll pray later when I've sorted all of this out. No, that's the time to go to God and humble yourself and ask for him to help you, because he is the kind of God who goes through the consequences of sin with us. He's alongside us no matter where we are, what's going on.
It's really, really good book during Lenten season by a person named Ortland. And his conclusion is that Jesus is waiting at the bottom of the pit, basically, for anybody to come to him. And he wants, that's where you need to, is at the time when you can say, I'm a sinner and I need help. And it doesn't matter what your sin is, he's there. And Jesus loves us to the uttermost, is what it said. That really impressed me.
And
And
that
a
when we
contrite heart is the most precious value to the Lord.
humility. Yeah. And the fact that when we grieve, we have a God who grieved with us. We have a Savior who stopped and cried before he raised Lazarus from the dead. Like, he didn't have to do that. Why did he do that? Because that's the kind of Savior he is, that he cries with us in our grief. Because he loves us. Yeah. All right, any last comments? Anything you want to add?
The important thing is to be memorizing the promises, and that's what keeps us going. All the promises of God.
Yeah. Okay, we will stop there. Things to pray about?